Hi, this is Holly, co-host of I'm a Fan of That. I'm just jumping in to let you know that my book, A History of Fans and Fandom, The Power and Passion of Fan Culture, is out now and available in all good bookshops, online and on Amazon. So please go out there, buy that book for your friends and family, and get nerdy and learn a bit about fandom with us. Thanks!
Hi, this is Vivian Asimos, and my book, Cosplay and the Dressing of Identity, is available for pre-order right now, coming out in September. You can pre-order it through the publisher's site, which is Reaction with a K, or through any major book retailers and on Amazon. So go pre-order! Thanks!
Woo!
Hello, and welcome to I'm a Fan of That, podcast about all things fandom told through objects, stories, and studies, with a bit of silliness along the way. Your hosts on this journey are pop culture writer, journalist, and cosplay expert, Holly Swinyard, and myself, Vivian Asimos, a public anthropologist and pop culture academic with a PhD in religion and popular culture. Join us as we wander down the incredible and intriguing path into fan culture, its history, the people who make it up, and the way that we look at this ever-growing part of our society. Fair warning, we may talk about some adult themes, use some adult language, and possibly get a little bit nerdy about the whole thing. You have been warned.
Hello and welcome to I'm a Fan of That, the show where we look at the wonderful world of fandom through the objects that we love. And this week, I have brought an object.
Ooh.
In fact, I've brought two because I kind of wasn't certain which one would land. And as I literally just said before we started recording, I could have brought any number of things because I'm a big... I feel like fan is maybe not the right word because I'm not necessarily a fan of exactly what we're talking about. I'm a fan of the concept. And the kind of general world idea. Because what I've brought is it's not the Necronomicon. It's a leather-bound, handmade paper notebook that I have.
Oh.
That I have collected over the years, the notes for my various games of Call of Cthulhu. And it's ever so slightly insane.
That is very cool.
So this is my little Necronomicon. And I've also used it as a prop for various cosplays or little bits of filming or whatever that I've done. So I've made it quite fancy as well. So it is technically the adventures that I have had with my friends in D&D, Call of Cthulhu, whatever it's called. But it's also my own personal little Necronomicon. I drew pictures and everything of the monsters that we face. I also have the more obvious thing, which is The Dream Cycle by H.P. Lovecraft. Which is one of my favourite books ever, because I am a terrible human being, clearly. But I love eldritch horror. It's one of, and weird fiction in general. It's one of my favourite genres of, I guess, speculative fiction. It's definitely my favourite genre of horror. I am not actually a big horror reader, despite what people might think, because I do love, Resident Evil, Silent Hill, this sort of stuff. I really enjoy horror video games. And I enjoy a lot of horror podcasts, but reading it not so much. I've always found that maybe I'm not a big Stephen King person, that kind of thing. It's not my vibe.
Stephen King's a bad writer, so
yeah, that's maybe it's just
come at me.
It may just be that I have yet to find, because actually Lovecraft, for the many, many terrible faults of him as a man,
yes,
is actually a good writer.
Yeah,
they are compelling stories.
Unfortunately.
He's a horrible human being. Just clarifying that straight off the top. We know
yes.
He is. I do not support any of his views. And I am very glad that people are reclaiming these stories and making them interesting and better and doing exciting new things with them. Because it means we get to move away from Lovecraft as a person. He's also dead, had no children, there is no estate. So the money just goes to a publisher somewhere. It doesn't really make any difference.
Yeah.
I think actually now it's public, it's out of copyright.
It is, yes.
So nobody makes any money off it, apart from the people writing these new stories and changing
So now's your time to buy Lovecraft!
So yeah, there we go. That's a good thing. We can talk about it. Because the reason I want to talk about Lovecraft and Cthulhu is because I think it's actually quite a pertinent thing to talk about in regards to the man himself and the things that he thought and all that kind of stuff, and the concept of death of the author, because I think it's an important thing to talk about right now for obvious reasons of certain wizarding school writers who we won't talk about, because lots of people compare the two.
Right.
There's a comparison between people like Lovecraft and the stories that he wrote, and those particular stories and that particular person. And so, slight warning, we will talk about it. But I think it's an interesting concept to talk about. But I also want to talk about it because there are so many people who are taking what is an incredibly problematic set of ideas and the stories crafted around them and turning them on their heads and playing with these ideas and bringing them into a new light in a way that I think up until now hasn't really been done. I would say in the last maybe decade, maybe a bit more than that, it's really come into a new kind of renaissance for weird fiction and eldritch horror that we hadn't been seeing before. And there's also some deconstructing of H.P. Lovecraft that I'd like to do, but I think everyone's already done that. Was he just afraid and hated the world because of his own issues? Yes. Yes,
Most
that's exactly it.
incredibly hateful people would probably fall under that category, to be fair.
So, I don't know how much you know Lovecraft, really.
Not much of him as a person, because I think I read Call of Cthulhu was the first one that I read.
Mm-hmm. I think that's what most people read.
Yeah, and I might have read one or two other ones, and it was just very clear. You don't have to do research into H.P. Lovecraft. If you just read it, it's very obvious that he's problematic.
I think that's not necessarily true if you read it as a teenager. I think if you were a teenager in the early 2000s or the 90s and you read it, you maybe wouldn't have cottoned on quite as quickly.
Maybe.
Because I know I have several friends who would say that they were massive Lovecraft fans and didn't know how problematic he was until I told them. I'm
trying to remember how old I was when I read it, because I was definitely... it was definitely before I moved to the UK.
Yeah.
And I moved to the UK years ago.
But it may just be depending on the environment you're in. If you're not thinking about it.
I think it was at undergrad, though.
Yeah.
So I was still quite young, but I was definitely at least capable of critical thought.
Yeah.
We'll put it that way.
I definitely would say that the people who I am thinking of would have read them at maybe 13 or 14, that kind of age, where you're sort of... teenagers now have a much bigger grasp on these ideas than I think we necessarily did. And I think that's a good thing. Like, it's a really good thing. But I also think it's quite interesting to see a lot of adults who are going, oh, Christ.
Yeah. Well, especially because at the time, so during my undergrad, a bit of Vivian history, I was not specializing in pop culture yet.
Yeah, sorry.
I was specializing in new religious movements. So I was particularly interested in the New Age movements, as well as anything that was kind of like what we would call like woo-woo.
Yeah.
People who are a bit on the woo-woo side. I really liked that, and so that's what I was studying. And when I read Lovecraft, there was a lot of commentary specifically on Theosophists, which is a new religious movement that I was actually studying at the time. I was studying it from a historical angle rather than now I do anthropology, but at the time I was more focused on lit analysis and historical readings. But it was just really fascinating that after reading work both by them and about them for so long, and then picking up Lovecraft, who did not like them.
Nope.
It threw me for a second, because I was like, I'm not,
just
not
quickly,
used to this.
Theosophists, I don't actually know exactly what they are.
Right. So it's, they're tricky. But basically, they're a new religious movement that started 1870, maybe?
Okay.
Oh, God, my undergrad professor is going to get mad at me that I've already it's been years, that I have forgotten all of the dates in history. But it was started by Helena Blavatsky.
What a name.
Helena Petrova Blavatsky, I believe. Yes. I think she was Roma. She was at least Eastern European of some flavor, came over to America and kind of also started bringing a lot of Eastern beliefs and understandings over to America and kind of created this new agey, new religious movement.
It was big at the time.
Yes, it was a lot. It was very much tied to spiritualism as far as historically and traces of it, but it wasn't spiritualism.
Is it sort of roughly the same sort of time as you're getting like Anthony Crowley doing nonsense?
Yes.
Yeah.
There's a lot of shit going on in America at this time.
Yeah.
Particularly post-Civil War America is rife with this because there was just so much death. Anytime that you're in a country where there's a lot of death very suddenly and almost a whole generation of people are kind of lost, you get a lot of really cool religions.
Yeah.
Because
Post-World War I, for example.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because people need to turn to something, and often that is some kind of religion, and when the established one isn't suffice, then they either make new ones or turn to something new. And spiritualism was right in the midst of this as well. The idea of doing seances is tied to spiritualism, connecting to the dead, where, hey, you suddenly lost your son.
Yeah.
We can talk to him. That's appealing. And Theosophy was right in the midst of that. And so yeah, they did a lot of Eastern stuff. It's a lot of problematic things as well, because obviously it's primarily white people going over to primarily Asia and taking things often out of context, and then establishing it in its kind of new arena. And so it gets really complicated when you study religions like this, because contemporary theosophists now have a history of it. Yeah. So it's established, but it's also kind of taken and removed, and so it's very tricky.
There's a level of Orientalism to it all.
Oh, very much so.
And
very,
that
very
gets
much
very
so.
confused, not just with Asia, but with the Arab world as well.
Yeah.
You know, you see a lot of it getting conflated, and it shouldn't be.
Yes. And, I mean, and Theosophy kind of took wherever they wanted. They were not like, oh, well, we only really focus on Japan. That wasn't really their establishment. They kind of grabbed from everywhere. But
from bits I know, there's bits of Egyptian culture in there, you know, all that kind of stuff, which you just kind of go, how does this make sense, you know?
Yeah, it's a very fascinating religion, and Helena particularly was an amazing woman to read about. Yeah. I had a biography back in the day of her. She's just a fascinating woman. So anyone who's interested to dig into that. But yeah, so what Lovecraft was picking up on was the Easternness of it.
Which, of course, he was a horrible racist. And
yes.
He hated that.
So when we talk about him being horrible, that's what we're referring to, is that he was an extreme racist. At the time, people considered it bad, and that's saying something for the time period.
Just as a little idea, there are things that Lovecraft refers to as horrific imagery of things that terrify him, particularly of Far East Asia, what we would call the areas of Japan and China and Korea, that he refers to. If you ever go and look up the painting he actually refers to, they're beautiful landscapes of these places, but they terrify him because he is so afraid of the unknown. Yeah, and it's bizarre. Like, the man was so strange. Yes. In the worst way possible.
So yeah, there's this religion that is essentially taking things from there and romanticizing it and bringing it back to Britain, and under this guise of it being mystical and the unknown being interesting. Yes. In that regard, and that was not something Lovecraft enjoyed.
Nope, he did not.
So it was always really fascinating to dig into it from the religions. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting religion stuff I can talk about, but
I think the thing that Lovecraft did, that is why these stories have remained, because let's be honest, there's a lot of horrible racist nonsense out there that does not have a legacy in the same way as this. You know, we have either recognised in the way that we have with writers like Kipling, what they were doing and the way they were talking about things and that kind of stuff, and had to decide what we do about that, or it's just sort of been forgotten. Or we have things with like Huckleberry Finn, where there is now a forward on the beginning or disclaimers and all this sort of stuff explaining about the period. Lovecraft kind of has a slightly different thing, in that it is impossible to remove or explain that, other than what the fuck, Because the horror he imagines is a horror of the unknown. And that essentially is what drove him to write these. The dreams he relates, the conversations he's talking about, the stories he writes, are because he is so afraid of difference, and likely probably because he was different. Make of that what you will, doesn't change the fact that he was terrible. But that means that the horror he creates is astonishing, in that, of course, the moment your world is changed and the veil is lifted, you go mad. You know, that is what they are about, is about how the moment you know beyond your existence, you cannot cope with it. Mm-hmm. Over and over and over again, that is the story that's being told in various different ways. That reaching too far, doing too much, understanding these things is scary. And that is a really interesting thing to read, particularly when you then apply it to different situations. But also, I find it interesting because he was also a terrible anti-Semite. I'll be shocked that when you look at this idea from a Jewish perspective, and I am fully aware that someone is probably going to correct me on this because I have not done enough reading, but I've done reading around the subject. In certain Jewish practices, the more you reach into the unknown, the more you search for meaning and finding God and all this sort of stuff, the closer you get to hope and to a sort of a more perfect understanding of being able to see it, which to me feels like the opposite of this. That the more you learn, the more you get to damnation, the closer you get to your own destruction. And I think that's a really interesting thing to see from somebody whose wife was Jewish, bizarrely, you know. Yeah. We're not even going to go into that. But to look at these concepts of the same thing from those two very different perspectives, from somebody who really, really hated Jewish people.
Can I bring up Rudolph Otto now?
Yes, you may.
Because I actually think that he's weirdly the midpoint between these. So Rudolph Otto was a theologian and scholar in religion who defined religion. There's a lot of them that have. Yeah. But his definition of religion was the most poetic, beautiful definition. I don't agree with him, but it's beautiful, beautiful definition. But it's, he used Latin to explain it by saying that, well, first off, religion is the idea around the noumen, which is what he called, like, the divine stuff.
Okay, yeah.
And the way that he described an experience with the numinous, the God thing, for lack of it, someone's going to correct me, it's very philosophical, it's very feeling forward, Otto's work, so it's very hard to put into words other than his. Yeah. But I'm doing my best. But basically, he described an experience with the numinous and the numen itself as the mysterium tremendum et fascinat. The mysterious, the tremendous, and the fascinating.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what Lovecraft is trying to put.
Yes.
But for him, that's terrifying.
Yes.
And so for him, all his characters, they're scared of it.
For Otto, it's both.
Yeah.
It's both the Jewish idea of hope and beauty and amazing and God and happiness.
And I don't want to say that in the Jewish tradition that's not terrifying.
Yeah.
Because obviously it is. And like I said, I have not done enough reading around it, and please, anybody who knows more about it, come and tell me, because I'm fascinated by it. I don't think you can ever have a level of, this is fine.
Yeah.
You know? But no, I think that's exactly it. That's exactly what Lovecraft is talking about.
It's all about awe and the actual definition of something being awful, in the sense where it's terrible, but it's also amazing and awe-inspiring, and it leaves you feeling really weird, but also good, but also terrible, and all of that stuff. And he describes Otto's work, he describes having a religious experience in these kinds of terms. And there's a part of me that does wonder whether Lovecraft had a weird religious experience that he wasn't expecting. Yeah. We used to, when I taught at Durham, we used to have a thing for undergrads. I don't know if I've told this story before on this podcast, but we used to do a thing where we would teach them how to do field work. And so part of that was that they would have to go out to a local religious group and do a little day there. Not day, but like have a little time there, then write up a little bit about it as a way of trying to practice this field work. And many students would pick going to the spiritualist church, speaking of spiritualism, because they thought it would be a bit of fun. Yeah. It's silly. They didn't really think much of it. And we had to start encouraging them to not do that. And then we had to just cancel doing this whole project, because students would have a religious experience and they would have, I kid you not, a full mental breakdown.
Wow.
They would have existential crises because they were experiencing something that was terrifying, that was weird, that they could not explain, and that they were not expecting.
And I think that's would be very close to why I think Lovecraft writes the way he does. I don't know. We don't know.
We don't know. We're speculating.
We're speculating. This is speculation. It's an idea. But when you read these books and when you look at it, some of it is just straight up racism, right?
Yes.
Straight up. The fucking one about the white gorilla. Jesus Christ. That's just racism. The one about the fish people, just racism, right? That one's about don't mix races. Like, Christ above, you know. But some of them, and particularly in the dreamscape, in the dream cycle stories, and particularly, I think, with Cthulhu, there is something that happened that caused that, because it's not just I'm being racist and talking about racism and being a racist dickhead. There is a massive amount of horror beyond it, there is a world, a universe out there we do not understand. I do think that could have been partially triggered by the scientific advancement of the age. Yeah. You know, I do think there's something to be said for this as a period of massive scientific, oh my god, I can't talk, advancement, and science fiction is becoming a thing and all that kind of stuff, and people are exploring what that means, you know. We just come off the back of the Industrial Revolution, all of that kind of thing, the electric light, Edison, blah, blah, blah. And so I can totally see that there's that element to it as well. The world is big and scary and I don't understand it and I'm small and afraid. That's what a lot of these people are, a lot of the characters in these books are experiencing. But I do wonder what religious element there was to it as well. Yeah. I also think the likelihood is he was horribly traumatized by something and never got over it.
I mean, all of the above.
All of
potentially.
The above. We're not going to diagnose Lovecraft. It's just fascinating when you read these books.
It's one of the things that I always found really interesting about horror, and I never really was super into horror when I was younger. I got more and more into it when I started doing my PhD, which was a creepypasta and horror writing. So I started really getting into horror, and that was when I was really discovering just how really cool horror is. Yeah. And one of the things as an anthropologist that I find fascinating about stories in general, but particularly about pop culture stories, is that they are always reactionary to what we are most afraid of. And horror, I think, is the best. Like, if you really want to look at what does a culture find scary, or what do they hold the most dear, you read their horror. Yeah, absolutely. Because that's the stuff that's at risk, is the things that they care the most about. Those are the things that are twisted. And the things that are coming after them are the things they most fear. Yeah. And it is, I mean, that's a very simplistic version. I get much more complicated than that. But it's on its surface what it is. Because
creepypasta is internet-based horror, essentially.
Yes.
It is literally online, and it is talking about things that can only exist in online spaces for the most part. It's why we see in the 90s and early 2000s a huge spate of horror to do with videotapes, cameras, TVs in general. Yeah. You know, the idea of things coming at you out of these spaces. I'm thinking of things like Siren Head as well, like the massive.
I love Siren Head.
Yeah, over exposure to CCTV and being watched all the time, and you know, that kind of thing. Yeah. I think Slender Man, which you've talked about a lot.
Yeah.
I think he falls into that category very.
Go buy my Slender Man book.
But, you know, Slender Man, I don't know that much about, but he is very much that kind of internet boogeyman, you know. He's come out of that culture. And again, it was done through YouTube, right? The original Slender Man stuff.
No, so it was originally Something Awful forums.
Oh, okay, yeah.
But from the Something Awful forums was when Marble Hornets started. Yeah. And they were actually posting the updates to the Something Awful forum at first, and then it grew beyond that. But that was very like that Blair Witch style, found footage.
Which again is a very indicative, because it's around the same time, right?
Yes,
it's very indicative of that kind of period. I think I would say the internet is very clearly the object of horror for us all. I mean, look at the amount of films and stuff that are coming out at the moment that are about, like, Unfriended or, you know, social media, this kind of stuff. It's really... I mean, Black Mirror is obviously going to be the one you jump to as well.
Well, yes.
Yeah. But there's so much about that, and I think when you look at Lovecraft and his contemporaries, who were not as bad as him, but still in that exciting, problematic scale, they're very, very afraid of this changing world and the fact that they no longer have control in it and they don't know what that looks like. Yeah. You know, and what are people going to become? Where are we going? You know, you can see that fear. I think, you know, that is what horror, you're right, it is, you show the thing that people are currently afraid of. Yeah. I mean, you think of the War of the Worlds broadcast and how everyone believed it because that was in their minds that this could happen, you know? It's crazy. Because you have to say that H.P. Lovecraft kind of he was the originator of these ideas, but there were a lot of other writers who are writing at the same time and picking up on each other's ideas, writing about things. You can actually, canonically, go from the H.P. Lovecraft books all the way over to Tarzan by characters who are mentioned and places that are mentioned, and it is a canon. Right? You can do that. It goes across. It's so strange, but because all these writers who were all writing for Weird Tales at the time, which is a magazine, and other various magazines and stuff, were shifting ideas, borrowing from each other, all this sort of stuff, like the Yellow King, who is very much a part of the Cthulhu mythos. I'm not sure that Lovecraft ever actually wrote about the Yellow King. Yeah. I think Hasta and the Yellow King are written about by other writers, and then the two are combined into the same thing. Again, someone will probably find me and correct me, but my understanding is, while we conflate all these things into Lovecraft, they weren't. Yeah. They were all various different writers who are writing different things. That's not to say that Lovecraft didn't write a huge canon of these books, because there are a lot. Yes. But it's not as much as people think, and a lot of what we think of now as the Cthulhu mythos was created by other people at the same time and after his death, who then took it and ran with it. Yeah. So it is very important that we remember that not all of this is one man's work, and that not all of it is one single set of ideas. And also that probably everyone involved in some way was a bit of a dickhead. But not all of them, hopefully. But I think that's why it is so long-lasting, though. Because it did pick up on something in the zeitgeist. And I think it maintains something. Like, all of these things, we have an incredible renaissance of, like I said, eldritch horror right now. And I think that is in some way to do with the fact that we are in a very similar time period. The world is changing, things are scary, we don't know what's going on, as the time when these were written. It was the 1920s, you know. Turn of the century has kind of got into full flow and things are scary, and there's plague, and there's war, and there's political upheaval, and there's new scientific advancements that people don't quite get and understand.
There's new social movements.
Exactly. All of these things, except I think now, the people who are using these stories are a very different group of people. Because the eldritch horror we're seeing, the ones that are doing well, the ones that are being, I guess, popular, or at least making a mark on people, are about queer people, are about people of colour, they're about outsiders, as we talked about this in the Cowboys thing, right? That a lot of these, I'm thinking of particularly the Magnus Archives, which has just, you know, run and run and run, it's so popular. Or Lovecraft Country. These are reclamation stories using these ideas, but being the people who, like, often, let's be honest, queer people relate to stories of the monstrous or the odd or the strange because they are made to feel like that, and so it is hard not to relate to that in some way when you read it or you experience it in a story. I don't think it's necessarily a good thing, but it is a thing. It's definitely something that's experienced.
It's a social thing. Again, when we talk about horror being a reflection of the society, monsters are part of that. And there's a book by Jeffrey Cohen, who the introduction of which has kind of established what has become known as monster studies. For anyone who doesn't know, anything you can think of, there is that studies in academia. You can just Google it. I'm sure you'll find it. But monster studies is a thing. It's a really fascinating little subset of disciplines that are all trying to get together and talk about monsters, and they're so much fun to hang out with. But basically, he set up this thing called the 7 Theses of Monsters, and it's basically 7 ways of understanding what a monster actually is and what it is fundamentally doing. And I'm not going to remember all 7 of them, but there are ones that particularly stand out to me that I use a lot and that I think also are demonstrative of a lot of queer experiences.
Yeah.
And
trying not to make a pun about demonstrative.
I know. I realized it as I was saying it. But basically, the first one, which I think is the 4th technically of his, but it's the one that I use the most, which is that the monster is a harbinger of categorical crisis. So basically saying the way that we go about the world and we learn about things as we grow up is that we have different little boxes in our head that we file things into. And everything has to fit into a nice little neat box. And the monster shows us that there are things that aren't fitting in these boxes.
Yeah.
And we don't like this.
Yeah.
And one of the examples sometimes used is actually the pig for Jewish food laws.
Oh, right, yeah.
Because you have a rule set for cloven hooves, and you have a rule set for chewing the cud. And pigs they don't fit into just one of those. They fit into both, and you can't have something fit into both because they have different rules, so it is a monster.
Is that why pig is so often representative of monsters in things?
Potentially. I mean, it's...
So I'm thinking of things like Lord of the Flies, you know?
Yeah.
Where you have...
I mean, there's probably a lot of reasons for it, but at least that's
fucking terrifying.
The theory for the Leviticus food rules.
Interesting.
My Lord and Savior, Mary Douglas, is the one that primarily talked about this. Although she didn't use Jeffrey Cohen and talk about monster studies, she was primarily just doing the category. But it's a really good example of that categorical crisis. I always also like to use vampires because...
Sexy vampires.
Because they fit into sexy, but no, it's because you have the life and the death, and you're not supposed to have something that is in both boxes. Mm-hmm. That doesn't make sense to have something in both boxes.
And I suppose as well, or vampires particularly, as I said, fit into this idea of sensuality and all this sort of stuff, going beyond the norms in inverted commas of what the sensual should be as much as the life and death, all this kind of stuff. So I definitely see why monsters and monstrous things are used as a way to explore this. I mean, Bram Stoker particularly, I think, was using Dracula very much as a way to explore his own homosexuality. Well, but there are hundreds of academics who've written about that, and I won't get into it. It's very interesting to see a reclamation of particularly Lovecraft, somebody who was not just racist and anti-Semitic, but also homophobic, also so many things, and his fear of the world being taken by those groups that he was afraid of, or hated, depending, and basically going, no, we are going to tell our stories with this because actually you were telling our stories but you didn't realise it. Yeah. Or you were trying to make us look bad, but actually, you know what, we're not, and this is okay, and we can tell stories through this. It doesn't matter if you think we're monstrous, because we can reclaim that. And I think it's incredibly interesting that it's not just Lovecraft, it's all horror. We're starting to see that in. And I love how we're really going around not talking about Frankenstein, because we're going to do an episode about Frankenstein just on its own. But I think seeing those kind of stories being inherently taken and played with and understood from this other, essentially the other side of the coin, it's really positive. It's a really good way of talking about it. Like, you could talk about the fact that the nature of Disney villains, for example, if you're going to talk about how we are kind of taught to categorise queerness as bad. Yes. Disney have done an awful lot of work on that front. Yeah. And I don't necessarily think it's on purpose.
No, I think I recently saw that the person who primarily designed a lot of those characters, like Scar, for example, was gay.
Yeah, exactly.
And he probably was just doing the kinds of personalities maybe he wanted to see. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I haven't read into it. I only just saw it. Like,
but I think that's probably not a bad way of thinking about it. And I also think that if you are desperately trying to show queerness on the screen in a time and a place that's just not allowed,
it's not anywhere.
Still incredibly difficult to do. Mm-hmm. You're going to look to do it anywhere, aren't you?
Yeah.
So maybe that's it. Maybe that's part of it, is that all of these things end up tangled together. And so now, I know we're talking about a queer experience, and it's very much its own thing for each person, but I do feel like there is very much this association for a lot of queer people with, well, you want me to be the bad guy, I'll be the bad guy, you know, and playing with it and having fun with it and being a bit wacky and being a bit crazy. And I'm not saying being bad, but, you know, just having fun with that stereotype. Yeah. And I think that, again, comes back to this thing of horror. If you're going to be the monster, be the monster, have fun with it, do something exciting, twist it, change people's perspective of what a monster is. Because you can. They don't fit in the box, right?
Yeah. But the thing is that since the 1920s, we have different, not massively different boxes, but we do. Yeah. We have slightly different boxes. And the more time that passes, the different boxes we get. Yeah. And the people that are made to feel monstrous now will hopefully not be as monstrous because there are different boxes that they are therefore either fitting in or not fitting in. And there'll be other people that are then being made to feel monstrous, and that's just going to be...
There's always, unfortunately, humans like a scapegoat.
Yes.
But...
Because also humans can't fit into neat boxes.
No.
So someone's going to not fit.
Physically impossible, guys.
It's just not going to happen. Yeah. But yeah, that's... Because I think what is really wonderful about queer people is that they don't fit into these boxes, and they don't fit into the boxes unapologetically.
Yeah.
And that can often be what the monster is the vampire is unapologetically the vampire. And, you know, that's just what we are.
This has brought us so wonderfully to the conversation about She Who Must Not Be Named. Because if you're talking about wanting to make queer people fit into boxes...
Yep.
Damn. We're not going to put her name in this because I don't want to.
You don't want to?
But I think it's very interesting that we're talking about death of the author, right? What we have just talked about with the fact that we're talking about people reclaiming the stories of Lovecraft and the stories of Cthulhu and everything that came with it and all the other people who've written about it and all this kind of stuff essentially amounts to death of the author, right? You can go all the way back to Lovecraft, but you can also say, I enjoy these things without it being about him. That is something that is very legitimate and absolutely fine. Because so many people have played with it, had their take on it, and in Death of the Author isn't, as an actual theory, isn't quite that.
Yes. I was about to say, a lot of people mistake what it actually is.
Yeah, exactly. It's not, I just want to remove this person from it, and therefore I'm in charge, and therefore Death of the Author. That's not how it works. It's the fact, Death of the Author is that the moment that the, and I'm going to get this slightly wrong, but it's essentially the moment that a piece of media or a creation or whatever goes out into the world. Everybody else has their own opinion of it, everyone else has their own reading of it, and therefore the author's reading isn't necessarily the most important one.
Yes. Because
you as the reader can take whatever you want from that thing,
It's
right?
about interpretation. Yes. So it's when somebody says, oh, I think this about Lord of the Rings, and then someone goes, oh, well, but Tolkien actually said, you can go, I don't give a shit what Tolkien said.
Because this is what I see,
Because this is what I see, and that is what Death of the Author is.
Exactly. It is not saying... I still like this thing and therefore I don't care and I'm still going to engage in it because I'm not technically giving an author money or giving them my time and all that sort of stuff. That's not what it is. Okay? But I do find it very interesting that people are trying to claim that they can do what has been done with Lovecraft with... And it's not just the Wizard School stories, other ones as well. Because actually you can't. Because there is still a connection to a person and a thing and nobody else has ever touched that thing, right? So... Oh, fuck it. In the case of Harry Potter, nobody but J.K. Rowling has ever written Harry Potter, right? There is no other writers who are involved. Fanfic writers, you don't count, I'm sorry.
Not for canon.
Not for canon. Not for published works, all this sort of stuff. And so the fandom, despite the fact that as much as they desperately want to remove themselves and tell new stories and all this kind of stuff, and reclaim it in the same way that these other writers who are now writing eldritch horror stories over the years and all this sort of stuff have reclaimed it and talked about it, they are wanting to do that, but they can't because the IP of Harry Potter is still very much a thing belonging to a single entity, a single human. And so I don't think you can separate those two things. And so it's very different as queer people trying to reclaim stories written by Lovecraft as opposed to Harry Potter. That makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying, to me, the biggest point is the number of hands in the pot. Because again, when we talk about storytelling, I've mentioned it many, many times before, mentioned it in the Cowboys, we'll probably mention it every single episode that we ever do. But stories, I think, they thrive off of new storytellers.
Yeah.
And to me, what makes the Cthulhu mythos a mythology is the fact that you have people taking it and changing it and publishing it, and then another person taking that and growing from it. And that creates this kind of network of stories, of interpretations, and new ideas and new involvement. And while it can be traced to Lovecraft, it is not only belonging to Lovecraft. And that's just not the case for your girl.
Yeah, it's not. And I think the difference as well is that with Lovecraft, I've talked about the Magnus Archives, right? The Magnus Archives never once uses any of the names or the terminology that exist in the Lovecraft stuff. But you know they're the same thing, right? You know it's the same idea. Like, there's no Cthulhu, there's no Hasta, there's no any of the gods, there's no Necronomicon, any of this kind of stuff that is the basis of these stories. There is entities that perform the same role within those stories, but they don't have the same names. But because culturally, if you're coming into it, you kind of get it. You don't need it to be the same thing, but you know it's the same thing, you know? Whereas with these other ones, we'll keep using Harry Potter as an example, it's not the only one. You cannot say that somebody else has gone and done the same thing with Harry Potter because that's physically impossible. You know, that then becomes a different story. You know, there are lots of people who claim that Harry Potter and the Worst Witch are the same thing. They're not. They're the same premise. But they're not the same thing. Whereas Eldritch Horror, because it's so much more a genre that spans from one sort of set of stories, that essentially Lovecraft created a thing and people ran with it, you don't have that same issue.
Do you think it's possible to do something like this now?
No. Because I don't think there's the same collaborative storytelling. Like, if Lovecraft was writing these stories now, he would own the IP, he'd do the thing, he wouldn't necessarily be sharing these ideas across other writers. It wouldn't be like, some of those writers weren't even working with him, they just liked his ideas and wrote their own stuff, and then it got published because nobody was checking each other and all this sort of thing. And maybe they got annoyed at each other every so often or whatever, but actually I don't think there was the same thing of I own this, the same feeling of that, because people were exploring ideas. I think that's something that fans do now. I think it's very much something that fans and fandom are doing, but like, this sort of stuff would have been classed as fan fiction. They were people writing stories as fans of genre or ideas that maybe now I don't think exists. I think there is still collaborative storytelling. I think it more exists in places like LARP.
And online spaces?
Slenderman? Yeah, exactly. So your creepypastas, all that kind of stuff. Even on YouTube and things. I think particularly on TikTok, that people are adding to these things. But I don't necessarily think it's quite the same, because while they're doing that, if one person in these collaborative storytelling decided to go and write a book about that thing, would they have to give credit to everybody else involved in it? Or would they own it and just be like, well, I'm just telling, you know, we all created a story together and I took some ideas from that and now I'm writing it down. And it's very difficult, because technically, in this case, everyone was writing things, it was all published, it all existed, it was all just swilling around ideas. I don't know. I think I think particularly because we live in a world of IPs and copyright and all that kind of stuff, which wasn't so much the case at the time, it's hard to do collaborative storytelling and collaborative creation by accident, which I'm not saying it was by accident, but it is much more accidental, much more organic. Let's say. You do not have to make people were not making a conscious choice to do world building. They were just going, that's a cool idea, I'm going to run with that, I'm going to do something with it. And so I don't necessarily think, the only place I've seen it happening is on TikTok, with these really large scale online LARP things that are being done. And I don't even know if those are really still happening. They were really popular during lockdown, because everyone's bored. But like, you know, I'm not sure if they're still going on, but that may just be because I'm not interacting with them.
Your Call of Cthulhu binder, I would say,
Yeah.
is collaborative storytelling.
Absolutely.
Tabletop role-playing games would be, by their nature, they have to be collaborative in some form.
Yeah. I'm just not...
But as far as, like, written, published novel, I think that is, where it gets a bit more complicated.
I think so. I think that's the difference. I do think collaborative storytelling is happening.
Yeah.
I think you're right. Tabletop role-playing games, people creating their own worlds within D&D. I think probably the closest thing we have to this is Critical Role. I would say the closest thing to the idea of what they were doing with the weird fiction magazines and that world building and all that kind of stuff is Critical Role. However, that is still very clearly one group of people who are all working together, predominantly with the world building of Matthew Mercer.
Yeah.
I don't think that's a bad thing. They're obviously doing great. That's lovely. I would say it's the closest we have to what the people who were working at the time in those weird fiction, sci-fi, speculative spaces were doing. Yeah, I would include people like Ursula Le Guin in the tail end of that. You know, all that kind of thing. I think it peters off in the 50s and 60s. But I would say through the turn of the century to about 1940, we're seeing this. Mm-hmm. And then it kind of drops off because IPs happen, people are publishing, it's no longer essentially, it stopped being the fuck around bit and started being the find out bit. You know, people stopped messing around and started creating actual works because they could, because it was popular. People were reading it, there was interest in it, so publishing houses were like, cool, we can sell your stuff. And the moment capitalism gets involved. Well, you know, because actually these guys, the Weird Tales was pretty much just self-published, right? The equivalent thereof. They were just making this thing and doing it and all this kind of stuff, and there were a few people in charge and a treasurer and all this sort of thing. A lot of these fan communities, sci-fi communities, literary communities that's what they were doing, right? There were loads of these things around. This is just probably the one that did the best. And so you kind of, they're sort of zines almost. They're not quite, but they're in that kind of mould. That they're very collaborative and people are kind of making them together and telling stories and having ideas. They get popular, people start buying them, want to read them, blah blah blah. Books, they want to put them together as a collective work, publishers get involved, etc, etc, etc. Suddenly there's an IP and there's copyright and there's less collaboration and all this kind of thing. I think it's around that time that you stop seeing people making works of fiction based off other people's works of fiction and it being okay. Like, is it Pratchett or Sherlock Holmes? It's Sherlock Holmes. Because you have the Sherlock Holmes books, right? And then you also have Raffles the Gentleman Thief, which is written by Arthur Conan Doyle's brother-in-law, who is making fun of Arthur Conan Doyle in his own book, right? So Raffles and Bunny are kind of a make-fun version of Holmes and Watson. Mm-hmm. And you can see that it's a riff. But it's okay because it's kind of separate. And lots of people were doing that sort of stuff, like rewriting their own versions of stories, right up until this point. Like, the Canterbury Tales is a perfect example of that. People rewrote their own versions of the Canterbury Tales over and over and over and over again. Chaucer could do fuck all about that. And I don't think he even knew. Like, how would he know? You know? It was the 13th century or something. Sorry, again, someone will correct me on that. It's probably the 12th century. People have been doing that for ages. There were versions of Byron where people rewrote their own versions or added to them and all this sort of stuff. What we would call fan fiction now. And I think that's it. The reason we can't see this sort of thing happening and this collaborative world building happening around things like Harry Potter is because it's fan fiction and it can't be published unless you scratch the numbers off and turn it into something else. As we've seen with numerous romance novels. 50 Shades of Grey, it's fan fiction of Twilight. You know, you change the names, you change the position. It's still come from Twilight. It's still the same as someone going, I really want to write about Cthulhu, but I'm going to change it slightly, I'm going to write it, I'm going to make a new god and put that in. It's the same idea, but in the 1920s, that could be collaborative writing, whereas now it has to be a different thing. Yeah. And I think that is essentially the difference. And that is why we can't have death of the author in regards to Harry Potter.
And that's why we can't have nice things.
Exactly. But to go back to the whole thing with this, that's why it's really exciting to see people with something that is now out of copyright go, let's be collaborative again, right?
Yeah.
Talk about Sherlock Holmes. How many Sherlock Holmes stories are there now that it's out of copyright? How many different versions of plays and using these characters and all that kind of stuff have happened to add to the mythos of Sherlock Holmes since it was out of copyright? So many. Even before it was out of copyright, there were so many. You know? I think they add to the canon in a way that fan fiction doesn't. And the same is true of these, that people are adding to a canon of eldritch ideas and playing with these names and changing it and doing new stories, whether that's just... Because essentially the thing with the Cthulhu Mythos as well is it's a collection of short stories, a lot of it. Of one person interacting with something and then being scared and running away or whatever, or having their own experience with it. And there's no one main character. So you can write as many stories as you want in that world because there's no one main character to play with. There are characters who have more about them, like if you go into enough eldritch horror, you will see the name Carter come up over and over and over again, because Carter is the main character of the dream cycle, right? Or one of the main characters of the dream cycle, and he's probably the most well known of the human characters. Whereas, like, you can go, I'm going to write a whole story about this whole world and make an entirely new character to be the main character in it, because it doesn't need to have existed before that, because everyone can interact with this in one way or another.
Yeah.
I think the perfect example of that is the Lovecraft Investigations that is currently on BBC Sounds, which is a podcast, which the first few are essentially retellings of the more famous Lovecraft stories, but they started to interweave their own story of a new eldritch thing into this, among it, and these new characters who are very clearly telling their own story, but using these as a base point. And that, because I think essentially from its inception is how these stories were being told, is why it can continue to be like that. Lovecraft Country, again, is a perfect example of that. None of those characters exist in H.P. Lovecraft. They wouldn't. They're black. You know? They're black people telling stories about how horrible it is to be a black person in the South, particularly. I think it's set in the 1950s. I can't remember, it was a while since I've watched it. About institutionalized racism and using the idea of the monstrous in that situation to talk about the way that white supremacy works. And the more they learn about how white supremacy is working, the more terrifying it gets and all that kind of stuff. Like, that's a very simplistic take on it. Watch it, it's really good. It's really, really scary as well. But, like, it's a really interesting way to show that actually what the monstrous is in these situations. And again, because you don't question that these people are having this experience, because that's how all of these stories work. You can't do that with Harry Potter. I just don't think you can. I don't think you can do it with a lot of things. So you can't have death of the author, damn it.
So we'll have to wait until Harry Potter is out of copyright.
Exactly.
And then suddenly.
Yeah. Unless they're going to be like the Tolkien estate and just never let it go.
Probably.
Yeah. So we'll see. We'll see what happens there. But it's not something we can do right now. I think J.K. Rowling and H.P. Lovecraft would get on now.
I mean, I could have told you that a while ago.
Yeah.
That they probably would have.
Please don't sue this podcast.
Allegedly would have gotten on. We'll never actually know.
This kind of went on a tangent. I wasn't expecting this episode to go on, but I'm pleased it did. I wanted to talk about that. It was exciting.
Are you surprised that you screamed about queer theory and...
No, I was more surprised that I went on a tangent about J.K. Rowling quite so quickly. I thought maybe I'd save it for a few episodes.
I mean, I think we've gone on tangents about her before, and we probably will again.
Yeah.
I think it's one of those weird things where when you talk about fandom, the Harry Potter fandom is such a big presence that it's hard to not talk about it, but obviously it comes with its own shitstorm. Yeah.
And I think particularly with this, there are so many similarities in the conversations that happen around these two things, and there is often a comparison from people talking about it. Like, I've definitely had people be like, but you like Lovecraft, so... And I'm like, actually, I enjoy the stories that he wrote, but I enjoy it, like I said at the beginning, it's the genre I enjoy. I absolutely am not a diehard. If someone took away all my Lovecraft books, I wouldn't be sad. There are other eldritch horror books I could read.
Yeah.
You know? There is other eldritch horror I could interact with. If you took away all my weird fiction, that might be a different thing, but I don't think that's the same. Because it's not him. Whereas I think if there are people who would be like, you can't take away my Harry Potter, because it just feels different. And so I feel like it's worth having this conversation when you talk about Lovecraft to show levels of comparability. Like, what is the comparison here? Why do we talk about these two people in the same way? And I think that's what I really wanted to talk about this in this episode. It wasn't necessarily that I wanted to talk about Eldritch Horror, though I love it. It's great, and we should definitely talk about it all the time. But it was actually to talk about how we react to reading into certain things and knowing certain things about the writer, and therefore understanding their work. Or an artist in general.
Yeah. It's always really complicated because I always find that it is very dependent on so many factors, the way that people respond to things. I mean, look at Michael Jackson as, I think, a good example of people clinging to something for the sake of memory. And I had to have a conversation very gently with my in-laws at one point because they were talking about something that was inherently racist because, you know, it was like from the 50s or, you know, something like that, or even earlier, that was inherently racist, and me and my husband kind of were like, oh, that's a little, and they got kind of defensive because they were like, oh, but that was, you know, childhood and we had all of these good memories with it.
Yeah.
And we had to have that conversation of like, you're allowed to maintain those memories.
Yeah.
But you don't have to continue the same mentality and ideology and items moving forward.
Yeah.
You don't have to have the item to have the memory.
Yeah.
And you can remember the good things. And you can also remember the good things with understanding the nuance to it. Things are not always inherently all good or all bad. And there can be things that you can cling to in Harry Potter or in Lovecraft that you find connection and you find as positive, and also understand that it comes with the burden of problematic.
Yeah, we've talked about Kipling already, and like Kipling is something that I connect very heavily with my dad, who, for people who don't know, my father passed away several years ago now. I think I've probably talked about that before, but I have a very heavy connection with particularly the Justo stories and Judge Jungle Book with my father, and unpicking the connotations of those works and my childhood memories of him and the fact that they were things that he loved is hard.
Yeah.
Because you just want to be, that was something I loved as a kid, that was something my dad loved, I want to love it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you have to be like, I need to deconstruct this, I need to think about this, I need to understand it. But you don't have to let it go. You just have to realise, I'm not going to go and buy another copy of the Jungle Book. Or we can enjoy the Jungle Book while still criticising it, you know?
Yeah.
I don't think the way that Disney tried to change it and make it less problematic in the new remake version was the right way to do that. I think it made it a worse story. There were better ways to do it. But that's personal opinion. And I'm sure they were trying to work out how to tell this story again. Maybe they just shouldn't have told the story again, you know? Yeah. And that would have been fine. Also, grizzly bears don't live in India, so that was just bad. That was just a bad choice.
I think it's just learning that you can... Human beings have the ability to hold multiple meanings of one thing at once. I know it is possible. I have seen it being possible. I study this thing being possible.
We've just talked about it for 45 minutes.
And so I think that's something that people need to learn to unpack when it comes to J.K. Rowling, that it is possible to hold the good and hold that while letting go of the other elements.
Yeah. And that is why I think when I say that they can't be reclaimed in the way that Eldritch Horror and Lovecraft have been reclaimed, it is because we are not at the point where the damage is not being done.
Yeah.
Like, we have to let it go. We have to acknowledge that this was a big part of our childhoods. Harry Potter was a huge part of my childhood, all that kind of stuff. It is what it is now, and that is something that... There is more to life than Harry Potter. Shockingly. And there is more to life than liking a book about horror and wanting it to be non-problematic because you're hoping it will be, you know?
Yeah.
So, this got really deep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, if people do want to explore Eldritch Horror, though, I would highly recommend it because it is a really, really interesting genre of its own. Weird fiction is a really, really interesting genre. I think what we would call weird fiction from the 1920s and 30s we're probably just calling eldritch horror now, though they aren't technically the same thing. Weird fiction doesn't have to be scary, it just has to be weird. You know, I would absolutely recommend that. It's doing fucking wonders in podcasting, because of what better platform to talk about things where you can't see the thing. You know? It's so much scarier if you can't see it. It doesn't work on screen in the same way. But yeah, Magus Archives, which I've talked about already. The White Vault, which is possibly the best horror podcast I've ever listened to, probably brings in elements of Scandinavian and Patagonian mythology as well. Really fascinating. That's great. And I'm now trying to think of any others. Lovecraft Investigations, obviously, which is on Spotify, but also on BBC Sounds. So the Lovecraft Investigations is part of a larger universe called the Pleasant Green universe, and the entirety of it is brilliant. There's also a series that runs alongside the Lovecraft Investigations called Who Killed Aldrich Kemp, and the two intermingle with each other, which is quite funny because that is essentially a James Bond spy kind of story.
Right.
Running alongside holy shit, eldritch horror exists and is real together at the same time. And like there's like infrasound and stuff is used in the spy stories, and you're there going, but magic is real. What is wrong with it? It's very entertaining to have these two things kind of interweave with each other. And there are several other series that also go along with that, though you can't. They're much harder to find because the BBC decided to not put them on BBC Sounds, and so have happy hunting. Yeah. If you do find them all, please tell me, because I want to listen to them. But yeah, that's great too, and I would also definitely recommend listening to it's another one by Rusty Quill, who do Magnus Archives, and it's completely gone out of my head, but it's set in America in the Deep South.
We'll link it.
Ireland, and some really interesting things.
We'll link it in the description.
Yes. Hi, Editing Holly here. I have remembered that this show is called The Silt Verses, and it's by Rusty Quill. Please give it a listen, it's amazing. Back to the show. There are some really, really good ones out there, and I'm sure that lots of people know other ones to talk about. Please tell each other. Communicate. It's great. But yeah, this has been really good. I've really enjoyed this discussion.
Yeah, I always enjoy a chat about monsters. Definitely.
We should do more of it. Good thing we are. Thank you very much for listening. I'm Holly Swinyard.
I'm Vivian Asimos.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Remember to like, review, and subscribe wherever you are listening to this podcast, and do give it a share. Tell your friends, family, fellow fans. Get the word out however you feel like you can. You can follow us on social media. Links are in the show notes, as well as some links to further reading for anyone who might be interested. Music for this episode was Nowhere Land by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0. This episode was produced by Vivian Asimos and Holly Swinyard.